The snowstorm came early, swallowing the Wyoming mountains without warning. A 45-year-old former Navy SEAL thought he was alone out there until he heard something that didn't belong to the wind. Beneath the snow, he found a woman chained to a steel post, barely alive, and her German shepherd lying at her feet, poisoned, but still trying to protect her. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted them erased, using winter as the weapon. What he pulled from the snow wasn't just 2 lives. It was a secret powerful enough to burn his home and turn the mountain into a battleground. If you believe compassion can rewrite destiny, like the video, subscribe for more stories, and comment where you're watching, see where this story will go. Winter arrived early in the high mountains of Wyoming, pressing down on the land with a weight that felt deliberate, as though the season itself had chosen this place to settle first. Snow layered the ridgelines in heavy silence, and the wind threaded through the old pine forest with a low, constant moan that carried memory as much as cold. David Walker had learned long ago that silence was never empty. At 45, he lived alone in a weathered log cabin tucked against the slope, far enough from the nearest town that no one passed without reason. He wore the same clothes every day, a dark brown leather jacket thick with age, and used its surface cracked and softened by years of smoke, snow, and neglect. Beneath it, a red and navy flannel shirt buttoned high against the cold. Faded blue jeans rubbed pale at the knees and seams, insulated leather boots scarred from rock and ice, and a gray wool scarf wrapped close around his throat. It was not a uniform, but it functioned like one. Consistency kept the past quiet. David had once been a Navy SEAL shaped by discipline and consequence, but the years after service had stripped away any appetite for noise or explanation. A mission gone wrong overseas, one that ended with men who never came home, and decisions that could not be undone, had altered something permanent inside him. He did not talk about it. He had learned that language failed under certain weights. Machines, weather, and land were easier to manage. They broke honestly. People did not. That afternoon, as the storm thickened faster than forecast, David moved along the outer fence line of his property, checking posts and wire with practiced efficiency. His movements were economical, deliberate, conserving heat and energy as instinct demanded. Snow fell harder now, swallowing sound, turning distance into guesswork. Even his boots felt muted beneath the drifts. That was when he heard it. The sound did not belong. It was not the sharp crack of a branch or the panicked cry of an animal. It was weaker than that, uneven, almost restrained, as if whatever produced it lacked the strength to finish the act of calling for help. A breath broken. A sound buried beneath snow. David stopped. His body responded before his mind caught up the old reflexes, surfacing without permission. He listened again, head angled slightly into the wind. The sound came once more, thinner this time, carried from below the tree line. He followed it downhill, breaking through drifts, noting the disturbed snow as he went. Something had been dragged here. When the trees thinned into a shallow clearing, he saw them. The woman was upright, bound to a rusted steel post, driven into frozen ground. Her body sagged forward unnaturally, knees buckling as if they had long since lost the ability to support her. She appeared to be in her late 30s, tall and slender, with a runner's build now compromised by exposure. Her skin, pale beneath the grime, had gone gray-blue at the lips. Dark brown hair, cut to shoulder length, clung to her face in stiff, icy strands. Her clothing, practical outdoor gear, was torn at the sleeves and soaked through, stained dark beneath a crust of snow. Even unconscious, there was resistance in her posture, a stubborn tension in her shoulders that suggested she had not surrendered easily. At her feet lay a German shepherd, full-grown and powerfully built, despite the tremors running through his frame. His black and tan coat was dulled by ice and dirt foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, breath coming shallow and uneven. One hind leg was bound with plastic cord chewed raw in a failed attempt at escape. Chemical burns mottled his muzzle and paws. The dog's amber eyes tracked David with exhausted awareness, not fear, but warning. Even now he angled his body toward the woman, positioning himself as a barrier. His name, David would later learn, was Max. He was 5 years old, trained, disciplined, and loyal beyond reason. The sight struck David with a force he had not anticipated. For a brief moment the storm, the clearing, and the frozen figures collapsed into a single, unbearable stillness. Then training reclaimed him. He moved quickly, cutting the woman's restraints, easing her weight down before circulation could shock her system. He shrugged off his leather jacket, the familiar heaviness leaving his shoulders, and wrapped it around her torso, pulling her close enough to feel the faint rise and fall of her chest. Her pulse was weak but present. He cleared the cord from the dog's leg, careful, methodical, noting the metallic, acrid scent beneath the snow. Poison. The dog did not resist. He leaned into David's touch eyes, never leaving the woman tail twitching once in exhausted trust. David rested a hand briefly against the animal's neck, feeling the tension there, the refusal to let go. This was no accident. The placement was too precise, the bindings too deliberate. Someone had chosen this spot, this weather, counting on cold and distance to finish what they had started. The mountain which David had believed indifferent had returned a message he had spent years avoiding. He gathered the woman into his arms, lifting her with careful strength, and coaxed the dog to follow. The storm closed in tighter erasing tracks, erasing options. As they moved uphill toward the cabin, David glanced back once more and froze. There, half filled by fresh snow but still unmistakable, were boot prints, human, recent, leading away into the trees. The wind rose, the snow fell heavier, and the woman remained unconscious against his chest while the dog's breathing grew thinner with each step. David Walker understood with absolute clarity that someone had been here not long ago and might still be close enough to hear the storm breathing with them. Snow pressed against the cabin windows in slow, deliberate waves, the storm no longer violent but patient, as if waiting to see what would survive the night. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, old iron, and antiseptic warmed by firelight. Sarah Collins woke as though pulled upward through freezing water. Consciousness returned in fragments, first heat against her skin, the dull ache of limbs reclaimed from numbness, the unfamiliar creak of a structure shifting under wind. She lay wrapped in layered blankets on a narrow cot, her body trembling not from fear, but from the aftershock of prolonged cold. Sarah was 38, tall and lean, with a build shaped by years of fieldwork rather than comfort. Her limbs were long and wiry, her shoulders narrow but strong, the posture of a woman accustomed to carrying equipment across uneven ground. Her skin pale and lightly freckled, flushed unevenly as circulation returned, revealing the early warning signs of frostbite along her cheekbones and nose. Her dark brown hair, usually kept in a low, practical braid, had been washed and left loose, drying in uneven waves that framed a face marked by restraint rather than softness. Her eyes opened fully, at last gray-green alert, searching. They moved before her head did, cataloging the room, with a professional instinct that did not rely on trust. She noted the walls' first rough-hewn logs blackened by age, the iron stove bolted to stone, the sparse shelves lined with tools instead of personal effects. This was not a place built for hospitality. It was built for endurance. David Walker stood near the far wall, partially turned away, his silhouette defined by firelight. Without the weight of his leather jacket, He looked older, somehow leaner, the angles of his frame more pronounced. His face was weathered jaw squared and heavy with gray-threaded stubble, the kind of beard grown out of indifference rather than style. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, etched there by years of restraint. His steel-blue eyes remained watchful even when his posture was still a habit formed long before the mountains claimed him. He did not approach when she stirred. He waited. Sarah shifted, testing her hands and feet, registering pain with quiet acceptance. Panic did not rise. Fear required uncertainty, and she already knew too much for that. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "Wyoming," David replied. "My cabin." His tone was neutral, stripped of unnecessary reassurance. He watched her breathing, the color returning to her skin, the way her jaw tightened as memory aligned. Her gaze drifted toward the hearth. There, on a folded tarp near the fire, lay the German Shepherd. Max's powerful frame was partially immobilized, his injured hind leg splinted with careful precision. His coat had been cleaned enough to reveal the classic black saddle over tan fur, though chemical burns still marked his muzzle and paws. He was quiet now, chest rising in an uneven rhythm, but his ears twitched when Sarah moved. When their eyes met, his tail thumped weakly once against the floor. Emotion crossed her face, then not hysteria, not relief, but something sharper and more controlled. Purpose. "He's alive," she said, more statement than question. Barely David answered. Poison. Not enough to finish the job. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the truth. When she opened them again, resolve had replaced exhaustion. They didn't want him dead. Not right away. David's brow furrowed slightly. "Max isn't a pet," she continued. "He's K9, environmental detection." She shifted carefully, propping herself higher despite the pain. "He's trained to recognize industrial solvents, heavy metals, synthetic byproducts in soil and water. A private program. Corporations fund it when they want clean paperwork, then pretend it doesn't exist." David absorbed this without comment. It fit what he had seen. The discipline in the dog's posture, even near collapse. The way he had positioned himself between danger and duty. Sarah's gaze hardened as memory settled fully into place. "I was assigned to assess a renewable infrastructure project," she said. "Pipeline expansion, green transition." That's how it was sold. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. The soil samples didn't agree. She described the data with clinical precision. Elevated toxicity, inconsistent mineral signatures, compounds that did not belong near a protected watershed. She had followed the trail north, trusting that documentation and procedure would protect her. Instead, her reports stalled. Emails went unanswered. Oversight meetings were postponed. Then the surveillance began. Unmarked vehicles, equipment interference. Max had reacted first, alerting to contaminants near sites that were supposedly clean. "They poisoned him when they realized I wouldn't stop," she said quietly. "Then they took me." David felt a familiar weight settle behind his ribs, the old geometry of intent and consequence. "Why leave you alive?" "So it would look like the storm did it?" Sarah replied. "No body, no confrontation. Just another professional who disappeared in the backcountry chasing bad data." Her hands curled into the blanket. "I wasn't supposed to come back." Silence stretched between them, thick but unforced. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of trees shedding snow. David thought of the boot prints he had seen, half-filled but recent enough to matter. If he had arrived an hour later, there would have been nothing left to find. He spoke at last. "If I hadn't heard you?" "You did." Sarah interrupted. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. That's the part they didn't calculate. Max stirred, then pushing himself slightly upright, despite the pain his body angling toward Sarah. She reached out instinctively, her fingers resting against his neck, feeling the warmth there. The bond between them was not sentimental. It was operational. Trust built through purpose, not comfort. David watched them, understanding something he had avoided naming. Whatever had been buried in the mountains was not finished. It had simply been interrupted. And interruption had consequences. Outside, the storm eased marginally, but the silence that followed felt more dangerous than the wind. David knew the pattern: exposure, delay, erasure. Someone believed time and weather could finish what they started. He moved toward the window, scanning the tree line. "You can stay here until you're stable," he said. "After that, we'll decide." Sarah followed his gaze. "They'll come back." David did not disagree. He tightened his scarf around his neck, already feeling the old instincts rearrange themselves into readiness. If he had not walked that fence line, the truth would have frozen with her in the snow. And now that it hadn't, there would be a response. Max exhaled slowly, settling again near the fire, his body positioned so he could see both humans at once. Outside, snow continued to fall, careful and thorough, as if eager to erase what had already been discovered. Morning in the Montana foothills arrived reluctantly, filtered through low cloud and timber, the cold lingering, as if unwilling to release its claim. Snow clung to rooftops, and power lines pressed flat by wind, giving the valley a muted, unfinished look. The town revealed itself gradually as David Walker drove the narrow road downward, his old truck moving carefully along rutted asphalt. It was not a dying place. That was the unsettling part. The buildings stood intact, freshly painted in places, storefront windows unbroken. Banners hung from lampposts, declaring commitment to clean energy and sustainable growth. Everything looked managed. Sarah Collins sat rigid in the passenger seat, her posture upright, despite lingering weakness. The color had returned to her face, though her skin remained pale against the gray wool collar pulled tight around her neck. Her dark brown hair was braided again, practical and severe, exposing a face sharpened by fatigue and focus rather than fear. She watched the town the way she watched data sets, searching for patterns rather than comfort. In the back seat, Max lay alert despite the splint on his leg. The German Shepherd's powerful frame filled the space, his black and tan coat clean, but still marked by healing burns. His amber eyes tracked movement beyond the windows, ears shifting at sounds too subtle for human notice. He was quieter now, not weakened, but deliberate, conserving energy the way trained animals did when something felt wrong. The town depended on a single corporate presence, though its name appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. Trucks bearing identical logos moved along designated routes. A newly built administrative office rose beside an aging grocery store. The economy was stable, the streets clean, the silence practiced. David felt it immediately, the way people moved without looking at one another for too long, the way conversations ended when strangers passed. This was not fear, exactly. It was habit. They parked near a public access stream cutting through the outskirts of town. On maps, the waterway fed into a larger watershed, supplying multiple communities downstream. On paper, it was monitored, protected, compliant. Max stiffened as soon as his paws touched the ground. His nose dropped low breath, pulling deep and controlled. He veered from the marked path, circling the bank with increasing agitation. Sarah followed, kneeling carefully despite the cold, her gloved fingers brushing the soil. It was darker than it should have been, clumped unnaturally. "He's not wrong," she murmured. "This isn't runoff." David felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. The town looked clean because it needed to, not because it was. They did not linger. Attention in places like this traveled faster than vehicles. Instead, they moved toward a maintenance depot on the town's edge, where industrial equipment rested beneath tarps and snowbanks. That was where they found Evan Brooks. Evan stood apart from the machinery, as though uncertain which side of it he belonged to. He was in his early 40s, medium height, with a build softened by office work but scarred by years in the field. His shoulders slumped not from exhaustion, but from resignation. His hair was thinning and prematurely gray, his beard uneven and untrimmed, as if grooming had lost its urgency. Chemical burns mottled his hands where gloves had failed him more than once. When David approached, Evan's eyes flicked immediately toward Max, then back to the truck, then to the road. His posture betrayed a lifetime of compliance learned the hard way. He was a man who followed procedures not because he believed in them, but because deviation had once cost him dearly. Years earlier, an accident under his supervision had injured a co-worker. Official reports named procedural failure. Evan absorbed the blame and learned what survival required: silence. "You shouldn't be here," Evan said quietly, his voice carrying no authority, only warning. Sarah met his gaze. "You know why I am." He swallowed. "I know what you found." His eyes dropped to the ground. "And I know what happens to people who don't stop looking." They spoke in fragments, careful of distance and ears. Evan confirmed what Sarah already knew. Waste was being buried under the cover of infrastructure expansion routed through shell contractors and expedited permits. Oversight existed only on paper. Monitoring stations were repositioned, data sets altered. When anomalies appeared, they were flagged and buried deeper. Max circled Evan, once then stopped, nose hovering inches from the man's jacket. Evan stiffened, then nodded slowly. "I was sent to fix a leak last month," he admitted. "Alone, no extraction scheduled." He flexed his burned hands unconsciously. "When I got sick, my calls went unanswered." David understood without explanation. This was not negligence. It was calculus. Evan hesitated only once more before speaking. "There's a site upstream, not on the books. I can give you coordinates." His voice dropped lower. "But after that, you didn't get them from me." Sarah nodded. She did not press. People like Evan did not need persuasion. They needed permission to stop pretending. They parted quickly. Evan returned to the depot, his back straighter than before, though the weight on his shoulders had not lifted. As David drove away, Max watched the man through the rear window until he disappeared behind machinery. Night fell early in the valley, the temperature dropping with punishing speed. David scanned the road constantly, mirrors checked and rechecked. Sarah remained silent, organizing notes in her mind, already reconstructing what had been destroyed. Max's breathing was steady, his attention unwavering. By morning, Evan Brooks was gone. His truck remained at the depot. His phone rang unanswered. No search was announced. No questions were asked. David stood at the edge of town, looking back at the banners, the clean streets, the quiet houses. He felt no surprise, only confirmation. This was not intimidation. Intimidation relied on fear. This was erasure. The kind that let communities continue functioning without disruption, without conscience. Max shifted beside him, ears angled toward the forest nose, lifting as if catching a distant signal. Sarah followed the line of his attention, her jaw tightening. The town resumed its routines around them as if nothing had happened at all. David Walker turned away from it with the certainty of a man who recognized the shape of the hunt. Whatever had been buried beneath the snow was protected not by secrecy alone, but by people who needed it to remain buried. And now someone who had stepped out of line had simply ceased to exist. Night fell hard over the Wyoming backcountry, the cold sharpening as wind threaded through the trees carrying the faint smell of snow and something far more dangerous, David Walker woke to heat before sound. It was not the comforting warmth of the stove, but a sudden aggressive pressure against the cabin walls, followed by the sharp crack of glass surrendering to temperature. His body moved before thought. Years of conditioning returned in an instant, his mind clearing with the precision of a man who had learned what hesitation cost. Smoke was already rolling low along the ceiling, thick and chemical wrong, in a way firewood never was. Sarah Collins coughed awake on the cot, confusion giving way to immediate awareness as her eyes fixed on the glow blooming through the far wall. Even weakened, her instincts were intact. She was tall and narrow-framed, her strength drawn from endurance rather than mass dark hair braided tight against her skull. For sleep, pale skin flushed now with heat and fear. She did not scream. She swung her legs down and reached for her boots with shaking hands, jaw clenched in effort. Max reacted before either of them spoke. The German shepherd surged upright from his place near the hearth, ignoring the protest of his injured leg. His black and tan coat caught the firelight as he moved, ears, flattened teeth bared in a low, warning growl that vibrated through his chest. He circled Sarah once, then fixed on the rear of the cabin body angled with intent. He had smelled this before. Accelerant. The first bottle struck the outer wall with a wet, shattering sound. Flames bloomed instantly, hungry and precise, climbing too fast for chance. There was no shouting, no engines, no silhouettes in the trees. This was not an attack meant to be witnessed. It was erasure. David cut the power without hesitation, plunging the cabin into a darkness broken only by firelight. He sealed interior doors, redirected airflow with practiced movements, buying seconds where minutes mattered. The leather jacket, dark brown, cracked heavy with years, came back onto his shoulders automatically. It felt like armor now. He wrapped the gray wool scarf tight around his neck and moved back through the smoke-choked space one last time, committing the layout to memory the way he once memorized rooms he did not expect to leave standing. Sarah staggered as heat and exhaustion collided. Max clamped onto the strap of her pack and pulled muscles straining as he guided her toward the rear exit David had cleared moments earlier. When she stumbled, disoriented by smoke and pain, Max adjusted instantly, lowering his body so she could lean against him without falling. His training showed not in obedience, but in adaptation. Outside, the night burned orange against the snow. Embers lifted into the wind like fleeing insects as the roof groaned, a sound David recognized too well. He guided Sarah downslope, using terrain to shield them from heat and observation, the fire roaring behind them with a finality that needed no confirmation. He did not pursue the attackers. He did not look for tracks. He understood the message clearly enough. They moved into the forest as the cabin surrendered to flame. Snow fell harder, eager to reclaim the ground, masking movement, muting distance. Within minutes, the familiar trail dissolved into white confusion. David adjusted their route instinctively, avoiding open lines favoring rock and timber. The cold was no longer an obstacle. It was a tool being used against them. The traps began subtly. Snow that looked untouched collapsed underfoot, revealing shallow pits meant to slow, not kill. Slopes that funneled movement toward narrow chutes, where a single misstep would send a body sliding into darkness. David read the land with grim attention, testing each step, redistributing weight so Sarah could keep moving. He did not speak. Words wasted breath. Sarah's strength faded in increments she could feel but refused to name. Her breathing shortened, her hands numb despite the gloves. She hated the weakness, hated the betrayal of her body after years of resilience. She forced herself forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant becoming still, and stillness meant death. Max stayed ahead, his injured leg stiffening in the cold, but his focus never wavered. He slowed when the ground felt wrong, redirected when the air carried the wrong scent. His amber eyes scanned the dark with disciplined patience. He was no longer just tracking contamination. He was tracking intent. Signal interference thickened as they moved deeper. David's receiver hissed and dyed the silence deliberate. This was not weather. This was planning. He felt the old calculus settle into place, the understanding that whoever hunted them preferred gravity cold and exhaustion to bullets. It was cleaner, quieter. Hours blurred into effort. Snow drove sideways, now visibility collapsing into arm's length. David's muscles burned beneath the leather jacket as he took more of Sarah's weight, his boots slipping on ice-slick stone. Each step was a decision not to turn back, not to surrender ground already paid for. He thought briefly of the cabin, of the years he had mistaken isolation for safety. The fire had corrected that illusion. They reached a narrow stand of fir, where the wind thinned momentarily. Sarah sagged against a tree-breath shallow eyes, unfocused. Max pressed his body against her legs, offering warmth measured in heartbeats. David scanned the dark senses stretched tight. He knew they were not meant to be chased into a confrontation. They were meant to be funneled, delayed, exhausted, until exposure finished what fire had started. He tightened the scarf around his neck and adjusted Sarah's pack closer to his chest, securing what little remained intact. Evidence mattered only if it survived. Lives mattered only if they kept moving. Behind them, the forest remained silent, complicit. Ahead, the storm offered no mercy. David Walker did not pray. He did not bargain. He simply moved step after deliberate step, accepting with cold clarity that winter itself was not the killer here. People were. And they were patient. Dawn never fully arrived on the mountain. It only lightened the storm enough to reveal how exposed everything truly was. Wind scoured the ridge in hard cutting sheets, snow lifting and falling again, as if the summit refused permanence. The Federal Relay Station emerged from the white like a scar in the rock, its concrete walls stained by decades of weather, its bent antenna humming faintly with static. It had been built to outlast storms rather than men. David Walker approached it with the deliberate patience of someone who understood both categories. At 45, his body carried the weight of old injuries and newer choices, his jaw set beneath a beard, grown rough and gray with neglect, his steel-blue eyes narrowed against the wind. The dark brown leather jacket clung to him like a second skin, cracked, and heavy flannel tight beneath it, scarf wrapped close to guard what little warmth remained. Sarah Collins stood a few yards downslope, braced against the wind. She was exhausted now, the lean strength that had carried her through years of fieldwork stretched thin by cold and pursuit. Her pale skin had taken on a translucent quality beneath the storm freckles, muted lips, pressed tight to control shivering. Dark hair, once carefully braided, had come loose at the edges, whipping against her cheekbones. Still, her eyes remained clear, sharp, with resolve rather than panic. Max stood between them, the German shepherd's injured leg stiff but functional, his black and tan coat rimed with ice. He was 5 years old, powerfully built, disciplined to the point of silence. His amber eyes moved constantly, measuring distance, scent, vibration. He did not whine. He did not hesitate. He understood assignment. David turned to Sarah and knelt briefly, tightening the straps on her pack, securing the data drives and soil samples against her chest. His movements were efficient, almost gentle. "You go now," he said, voice low but steady. "Follow the route we marked. Keep moving." She shook her head, once anger and fear colliding behind her eyes. "You won't make it down in this." He met her gaze without flinching. "I don't need to." She understood then. The truth settled with a weight that did not allow argument. The station was the only place where a signal might bleed through the interference choking the valley. Reaching it had already cost them time, warmth, and blood. Descending together would cost more than they could afford. Max sensed the shift immediately. He stepped closer to David, pressing his shoulder briefly against the man's leg before returning to Sarah's side. His posture tightened, torn between duty and bond. David rested a hand against the dog's neck, feeling the steady thrum of life there. "Take her," he said quietly. It was not a command. It was trust. Sarah swallowed, forcing her breath steady. She reached out her gloved hand, resting against the leather sleeve of David's jacket, fingers curling as if to memorize its texture. "You stay alive," she said the words, less request than requirement. He nodded once. No promises. Promises were fragile things. They parted without ceremony. Sarah turned downslope Max at her side, his body angled protectively, stopping when she faltered, starting again when she could. David watched them descend until the storm swallowed their shapes completely, then turned back to the station. Inside, the air smelled of cold metal and old oil. Power flickered unreliable but present. David moved with practiced precision, aligning frequencies by memory, when instruments failed, compressing files until integrity balanced against time. His fingers burned and numbed in cycles, blood seeping into insulation, where a fall had torn skin and muscle. He ignored it. Pain was information. It did not get a vote. Outside, the wind found new voices. The structure shuddered, protesting intrusion. David anchored the antenna, locking the transmission cycle with movements reduced to habit. When the final confirmation light flickered, relief did not come. Only clarity. The truth was traveling now beyond the ridge, beyond the weather. It could no longer be buried. He slumped briefly against the console, breath shallow, then forced himself upright. The storm had not finished asking its price. On the descent, Sarah slipped as the ridge fractured along a hidden seam, gravity claiming her toward a narrow chute falling into shadow. Max moved without hesitation, launching himself across the breaking-edge claws, screaming against rock as he anchored his weight. David heard it through the walls and was already moving. He threw his body into the wind tools, biting into ice, arresting the slide by force and leverage alone. A buried charge shifted underfoot, collapsing the ledge. Pain tore through David's leg, bright and absolute. He did not fall. He dragged Sarah back to stable ground, secured her into Max's harness, with hands that shook despite his will, and pointed them downhill into the storm's lesser anger. Max hesitated only a fraction of a second before obeying, guiding her away with the shepherd's insistence, stopping when she faltered, pressing his body against hers, whenever they paused to share warmth measured in heartbeats. David returned to the station, blood darkening the snow behind him. He finished what he had started and waited. The mountain pressed down, patient, confident in time. When access finally became possible, the responders arrived with procedure rather than urgency, moving in disciplined silence. David Walker was found inside the station, frost locked into his beard face, gaunt, but composed, his body folded around injury as if to shield it. Max lay pressed against him, broad chest rising and falling with measured insistence, his body positioned as a barrier to the wind. The rescue unfolded without spectacle. Heat returned carefully. Bones were set. Blood was stopped. Max refused separation until it became medically necessary, his eyes tracking every movement with disciplined suspicion, before yielding when Sarah arrived steadier, now her presence grounding him. She bent briefly and pressed her forehead to his neck, gratitude expressed without words. The data did its work elsewhere. Investigations opened. Permits froze. projects halted. Soil and water were reclaimed from secrecy. The land breathed again, not in triumph, but in relief. David did not leave the mountain. He returned when he could walk, then when he could stand without pain. He stayed not as a hero, but as a witness. The relay station became something new, its cold steel softened by purpose. David maintained it, trained others to notice, to record, to refuse silence. Max aged into his roll muzzle, silvering at the edges, presence steady as weather. Sarah moved on to testify and rebuild no longer alone. And when winter came again, it fell cleanly. The truth had not been buried. Someone had stayed. This story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or parted seas. Sometimes God works quietly through a man who chooses not to walk away, through a dog that refuses to abandon his duty, through a single act of courage, when silence would be easier. In our daily lives, we face smaller mountains every day, moments when truth feels risky, when comfort tempts us to look away, when staying costs more than leaving. Faith is not proven in grand gestures, but in the decision to stand firm when no one is watching. If this story moved your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part spoke to you. Subscribe to the channel so these stories can continue to be told. May God watch over you, strengthen your steps, and bless your home and loved ones with peace.